Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the West Virginia Archives and History Library. Thanks for braving the weather. Not quite like it was last year when we first started out, but I think tomorrow is supposed to be pretty close to what it was last year. But we'd like to announce a few upcoming lectures. On January 15th, Genealogy Research Strategies with yours truly, Randy Martin. February the 3rd, Land Grants in West Virginia with Russ Rawlingson. February 26th, Opera in West Virginia with our very own Commissioner, Randall Reed Smith. We do have on our website, wv.culture, westvirginiaculture.org, /history to get to the archives website. We do have on one of the links on the under the link What's Happening at West Virginia Archives and History. We do have those up until the end of April, and we do have our other speakers scheduled for the rest of the year, but we do have up to April in our website there. Tonight, Greg Carroll will present Slavery and Free People of Color in Virginia. Greg will look at the political and legal lives of both slaves and the free people of color. Slavery did not exist in Western Virginia anywhere near the numbers that it did in the East. In a few areas, such as the Eastern Panhandle and the Kanawha Valley, slaves were more numerous. The Panhandle was primarily an agricultural area, having more in common with its eastern neighbors than counties to the west. In the Kanawha Valley, slaves were mainly used in the salt industry and were the first to commercially mine coal in this area. Free people of color were often freed slaves or mixed-race people who were slowly being driven from the eastern Virginia counties by oppressive racial laws. This was especially true after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. These issues will be discussed and questions are invited. Greg has lectured on Native Americans, the Civil War, and slavery. A resident of Putnam County for 45 years, he has worked as a historian at the West Virginia Archives and History for 23 years before retiring in 2012. Greg serves on the boards of West Virginia Citizen Action Group, the West Virginia Environmental Council, and the West Virginia International Film Festival. Please welcome Greg Carroll.
Thanks a lot. Can y'all hear me with this mic the way we have it set up? I think I turned it up just a little bit. I also forced my voice into the microphones more. And I don't have a nice, pretty little PowerPoint presentation for you. I have come to the conclusion that I'm not in favor of them. Do y'all remember how so often you start watching the screen as if you're looking at a PBS documentary and you don't even care who's up here talking? Actually, I want to see your faces more, so I want to see people's eyes. I feel it's a little more professorial, perhaps, but also helps with dialogue. And until I can get a really good, a really nice PowerPoint presentation for any of my topics, I'm not going to do one yet. So no pretty pictures. We do have things I will pass out as we go along. If we don't have enough to pass out, we'll tell you, and you tell us, and we'll copy some more for you if you need some. Just a little bit of information. I also have a bunch of books up here I'm going to show you as we go along. The Archives Library is a place where much information is stored, and many more people should utilize it that don't. And that's unfortunate. So, oh, that reminds me. See, if I can't do a PowerPoint presentation like yours, then I'm not going to do one. Yours was so good. It's hard to compete with that. She did one on Native American women that was excellent. I've also seen several good ones here with a variety of speakers. The situation tonight is we have a huge topic that we're just going to go over as best we can. It's very complex. To me, it's even more emotional after the past 5 months of what we have seen happening across our country. The the racial connotations of so much of our political situation. I'm not the kind of person that shies away from discussing those, so ask any question you wish later, because historians are all prejudiced, folks. They all have their opinions. Those that come here and act neutral are not. They're fibbing. And I am not neutral, and I don't pretend to be. So the subject we have is a very huge and in many ways tragic and disastrous subject. My theme tonight is going to try to be about lost opportunities. And you're going to see several lost opportunities here in Virginia and later West Virginia as we go along. I'm going to concentrate on about 1620 to about 1860. Now that's a long history we just talked about there, but we're going to go over it as quick as we can. I talk fast, and remember your questions if you wish to bring one up. I'm also going to introduce some of the stuff they have here. I think what's kind of interesting is that they have recently gotten here in the state archives Virginia legislative petitions. Beginning in 1774, Virginia citizens petitioned the legislature for private, public, and political concerns that could not be addressed by or were not properly tended to by the local authorities. Oftentimes, you would find slaves and free blacks attempting to use petitions to the Virginia State Assembly as ways to redress, obviously, unfair and unjust decisions. So they're right here to look at, and I advise people to do so. The black laws that we're going to talk about later are so heinous and strenuous that I think these petitions are going to be those that relate to a variety of unjust situations. So they have them here. Ask for them later, and they'll show them to you. We have a little sheet on the Virginia legislative petitions, and these are for the West Virginia counties. So they should pertain to our counties. And it may be hard to find personal names in these, but I think they're worth looking at. So ask about those later. We have copies of these, and a really good thing they've done for tonight is resources of African American history and genealogy in West Virginia. Please grab one of these as we go out, because these are going to be good. This is what's right here in your state archives. And remember, this is not some building somewhere with a bunch of bureaucrats in it. This is actually your building. You are paying for the West Virginia State Archives. You need to remember that. It is your public building. These are your public records. So utilize them. We'll pass these out later. Thanks for coming on this cold night. I didn't expect this many folks to show up. Our subject tonight is a huge and complex one. We will be able to go over some basic facts and realities. I have spoken before here on a variety of subjects, like, for instance, the Melungeon people. I did that, I think, about 3 years ago. In discussing these topics about slavery, I wish to say right off the bat that I consider the slave states that were established in Virginia and all through the southern part of the first colonies, and then the United States of America later, to be a huge human disaster that led straight to our bloody Civil War. This is not a subject one can be dispassionate about. That's why I'm going to refer, as we go through tonight, some of our lost opportunities, because things did not have to turn out the way they did. And I'm going to try to go over the reasons I think they did turn out the way they did. As most of you know, the southern slave colonies demanded and received an early acceptance of the entire system of slavery before they would ever even consider joining the new United States. These concessions were made over the strenuous objections of many of the delegates of our first Constitutional Convention. Many of these delegates pointed out that the American Revolution had been ostensibly fought for the rights of man, for equality and freedom, concepts that seemed to run diametrically opposite to the establishment of state-recognized slavery. But the southern states, controlled by a rich planter aristocracy, simply threatened to torpedo the entire new nation if their peculiar institution was not allowed. Vague notions of an eventual abolition were hinted at, but never even fully discussed. And as the Southern economy became more and more entwined with slavery over the next 50 years, even the public discussion of abolition was considered a hanging offense. That means right here in the western counties also. We'll talk more about that later. To begin, the first African people brought to the Virginia colony arrived in around 1619 on a Dutch privateer. Some believe that these pirates had stolen the Africans from a Portuguese ship, bringing them to Jamestown after they stole them. This Portuguese designation will further muddy the racial waters as time and mixed marriages produced a large population of biracial and triracial Americans. In the English colony, the original labor system was one of indentured servitude. This is important to remember. The slave system itself was not established in England, and the English law in Jamestown at the very first was an indentured servant law. They had criminals, of course, not just indentured servants coming over here to serve the plantation owners. But in this system, the servants usually paid for their passage to the New World by contracting themselves out for a certain number of years, usually 7 to 20. With the addition of these 20 Africans, 18 males and 2 females, to the colonial labor force, a new racial mix was added to the Virginia population. In these early days, the racial stigma of African was never as powerful and demeaning as it was later to become. Black servants worked right beside Irish, English, and Native Americans. But the native population never was a reliable workforce. Native Americans weren't used to taking orders. The situation with Native Americans also, and we know this, they lived here. They could run away. African folks, as they're brought in, have not got an easy escape route. The native people did have an escape route, and they left in large numbers. But we need to remember, the first slaves were Indians. The first slaves in Virginia were not blacks, they were Native Americans. And they proved to be not very good at the work they were supposed to do. And they also had a quick and easy place to melt into, the great western part of this continent. The big change in the colonial economy was the skyrocketing price of tobacco. New lands had to be quickly cleared, and a massive infusion of fresh labor was called for, especially when the natives proved to be so unhelpful. This demand occurred at the same time that the English merchants had taken over the Atlantic slave trade. Large numbers of slaves were now landing in Virginia's ports, with no contractual protections at all. There was another reason for the rise in the number of slaves. The dreaded disease malaria had so infected the southern Atlantic coast that many of the Irish, English, Scottish indentured servants and/or various prisoners that were sent immediately died of malaria. It's another one of these things where germs and microbes play a lot of historical significance, because the African folks had been exposed to malaria in Africa and had some, not perfect, but some built up immunities. The dreaded disease was affecting everyone because there was no treatment for malaria in those days. Who had the slaves come to serve? Well, they'd come to serve the rising number of tobacco lords all around Chesapeake Bay. Those tobacco lords had quickly realized that everybody loved tobacco. They're all smoking tobacco over there in London. That tobacco price rose and rose. It demanded more and more labor. They did not want to have free labor because the free folks might leave after 7 years. They began to quickly realize that African slaves could not leave. Those folks were brought in because they were the most economically sound system. That's proven to be not the case later, as people realized that free labor would have been a better, a much more efficient capitalist structure. Another lost opportunity right there. I also want to point out that, you remember that and I mention this every time I speak practically, the death of the Indian people from smallpox was vast. Sometimes up to 92% of tribes died from smallpox. And I always ask people, do you know why the African slaves that were brought in did not die of smallpox at this level? They had cattle in Africa. Those cattle had cowpox, and that cowpox had given the African people some immunities to smallpox. And that's a huge factor all across America. It ravaged the Indians. It did not kill as many of the black slaves. Meanwhile, over the years, many African peoples had earned their freedom by completing their indentured contracts, if they had one, or had been freed by their masters because of their hard work. Many times, young slaves could earn their own freedom. And I mean this in the early time periods. We're talking 1630s, 1640s, 1650s. There was also the simple fact that their masters were also their fathers. Sexual abuse of slaves, the use of slaves, women as basically as incubators for more slaves, was now coming into play all across Virginia. It's interesting to note many times the writings of the master's wives when they have to look out the backyard window and see a large number of little mulatto children running around that look a lot like their husbands. And it is repeated over and over again, much to the chagrin of those southern women who were forced to deal with a mixed-race population, whether they liked it or not. Quite importantly, there was no laws against marriage between African, Indian, or white people. This is where we first begin to see mixed-race folks. And we first begin to have the designation of free people of color. You're a young black worker, you work well. After 15 years, you are now buying your own freedom. Your master may give you even a piece of property or land. You may have a skill that you practice like blacksmith. And you may want to marry an Irish girl. There are no laws to prevent that clear up to the 1680s. So you can see immediately that there is a mixed race population taking place. And that goes for Native Americans also. Native American folks were oftentimes taking escaped slaves into the tribes. These escaped slaves could speak English. These escaped slaves could serve as go-betweens between the traders, the white traders from places like Richmond, places like Charleston. They would bring out the goods. The Indians could use the English-speaking black slaves as go-betweens. And there was a large number of escaped slaves now heading into the mountains. Many of these newly freed people realized that they can also own businesses and land. So here is an opportunity for Virginia to wise up, to begin to phase out slavery and start free labor and respect for free people of color. Unfortunately, once again, that did not happen. As large plantation systems began to buy up all the smaller farms and tobacco allotments, a huge new slave population was growing right beside these free people of color and at a faster pace. I'm going to pass out some interesting stuff just so we can pass it around. You can look at it. Pass some of those out on this side. Pass a few of these out behind you. I'm going to mention that as you see these maps, there are folks. I'm going to show y'all how interesting these facts and figures are. Look how they have studied so well now. This is the latest, really the latest scholarship. They have taken percentages from the boats, the slave ships that came over have such good records that they can show you who ends up in the Chesapeake area. Now, here's what I think is interesting. Can you see how an African American brought to the Chesapeake, Virginia colony can quickly have children? Those children are no longer connected directly to Africa. They are a new culture, African American culture. Think about how strongly the tribal connections are in Africa. Igbo, Angola, Guinea. These tribal connections were very strong for slaves who had just been brought over to the colonies. But their children do not have that direct connection to tribal reality. They have a connection to English, to Christianity, and to a slave system they have grown up in. So you can see very quickly how changing cultural realities create a new African American culture that is not directly connected to the old African systems. And that means even tribal systems. Those young African Americans think of themselves as Americans, not as Africans. And that's an important point as we go toward the Civil War. It is at this point that Virginia begins to embrace slavery as its future. It is here in the 1680s that the fatal decisions are made which set Virginia and the rest of the southern colonies on the economic path that is soon to be rejected by the rest of the civilized world as inhumane, unchristian, and most importantly, inefficient for a modern capitalist viewpoint. As the slave system becomes all-powerful, the example of the free people of color, those folks who have dark skin, but who are supposed to be free and retain rights of freemen, suddenly they're living right beside the slaves. You have young African Americans looking over, that are slaves, that are looking over at the free people of color, and well, why can't I have a shop? Why can't I sell my labor like they're selling their labor? Very quickly, a system of draconian black laws are passed in Virginia. These black laws are violent. They are punishment for free people of color who get out of line, and they set strict standards that eventually will force free people of color out of the eastern counties all across the eastern seaboard. They force free people of color to leave those counties. They do not want to have free people of color living and talking to their slave populations. They don't want that to happen. I'm going to pass out a good reference that any of y'all can look up. The listings of these black laws are listed right online if you wish to look them up. I'm going to pass a few of these out. I just have a page copied because I wanted to show just a few of the early black laws. And these are extremely interesting because they create black laws right up to the end of to the start of the Civil War. They're still passing black laws, hoping to keep their slave populations in line. That's just a few of the examples. And these are they're really done well by a woman named June Purcell Guild. I really like them because they show the way that the Virginia State Legislature is passing black laws. And I will have more copies of these up here if you want to see the whole list. I've got a whole list of them. So there's page 2. Those are just examples of the black laws. And give yourself a couple of those. I highly recommend looking at those black laws because we are not taught this in school, as you might have figured. We are not taught that these laws were ingrained in the Virginia Constitution. As the slave system becomes all-powerful, the example of free people of color becomes intolerable. How can plantation owners tell their slaves that they can't learn to read and write, not even allowed to establish their own Christian churches, and yet they have to live right across the road from a free person of color? That is not tolerable. Some of these free people of color had been in the community so long, they were even in the militia, which means they carried guns. One more threat to the white system. One can see how this situation was utterly intolerable, especially when Tidewater counties were beginning to have black slaves as there was many more white owners of slaves by then. And in the 1680s and 1690s, this legislative battle, this fight against slave mentality, I mean, literally any kind of slave revolt was to be put down. We all know that there are rumblings of slave revolts in the Caribbean area. We all know Santo Domingo, we know Haiti, we know that white slave owners are getting very scared. The legislation becomes an avalanche of rules, penalties, taxes, regulations, and they continue right up to the death of the Confederacy in 1865. These Virginia black laws vary in harshness and complexity, but are basically repeated. You can see them in any state in the South. The same black laws are created in South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama. All of them have their own black laws. As one can see, the subject of slavery and its perfection as a social and economic system seems to be a continuous topic in Williamsburg and then Richmond. As the threat of slave rebellion, as occurred in Haiti and elsewhere, becomes more worrisome, new laws of control and suppression are implemented. Even the reward of emancipation is held out to certain slaves who will squeal on their fellow slaves and turn them in if they're planning a rebellion. After the infamous 1831 Nat Turner slave rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia, these laws also reinvigorated the old militia system, causing many counties to initiate troops of constables, which would nightly patrol the Negro quarters. You've all heard of the night patrol. This is where it starts. This also starts a militarization of the Virginia counties. By the time the Civil War comes up, these guys have been marching for years to protect themselves against their own slave populations. They're very well trained militarily up to that point. There is a list of such officers in Monongalia County, for instance. Here in the archives, I've found a list of those officers. There were even fines against white folks who refused to serve in the night patrol. They got fined. Now, coincidentally enough, I have noticed that in the early laws, the counties west of the Blue Ridge are accepted from this act. They didn't have to follow through because there were so few black folks over here. They let them go for a while. Naturally, there were far fewer slaves in the western counties of Virginia, and this population difference was to widen as the 1800s wore on. But from the start of these western counties, there grew an awareness that the taxation of property, which they paid over here in the western counties, we paid in full, was not being paid in full by the rich aristocracy in the Tidewater of Virginia. They did not have to pay full value for their slaves. There were over and over Western Virginia delegates that attempted to right this system in the state constitutional conventions. The Convention of 1829 and 1830 even discussed the eventual abolition of slavery over a specific period of time. And the famous Ruffner pamphlet, which many of y'all have maybe seen or read, shows how many leaders here in the western counties viewed slavery as a huge negative for Virginia. I will point out that Ruffner is not so much concerned with the moral issues as he is with the economic issues. Free labor was his main point. All these progressive ideas were shot down by the Tidewater aristocracy, or watered down by the Assembly into meaningless gestures to try and appease western counties. That is another lost opportunity. The lost opportunity means that the folks that didn't own slaves should have stood up for themselves and said, wait a second, we're not going to buy into this system anymore when your property is taxed at a lower level than our property. Another lost opportunity for the people of Virginia, and especially the western counties. In addition, the eastern part of the state was experiencing a great decline in its agricultural output because the continuous growing of tobacco had decimated the soil itself. Does anybody grow tobacco, or has anybody grown tobacco here? I worked in the tobacco fields of my uncles, and eventually those fields were so depleted that they had to bring in entire truckloads of bags of fertilizer to keep those fields going. And I hate to say it, but we fertilized, and it's still, you lose productivity because tobacco eats up the soil. The soil was being eaten up in those counties. The rich plantations now begin to make more money selling slaves to the far southern states than they did having their slaves actually work the fields. This is a very important fact inside Virginia politics and in the social system that slavery had created. They burned the soil up after bringing in thousands of slaves to work these fields. They then begin to realize they can sell these slaves down into the areas of the new cotton empire that Virginia is not part of. That means they're beginning to break up slave families. That means they're selling off young slaves. That means they're damaging slave mentalities when they do this. And you can go right back in there in your own West Virginia archives where the newspapers are, and you can find ads right in the newspapers. Slaves to sell. 1848, 1852. Slaves to sell downriver. That's where the term, they sold me down the river. You've all heard of that term? Well, it came from selling slaves into Texas, Louisiana, and Alabama, where the new cotton empire was coming to play. I'm going to pass out a little map that shows the number of counties that had 50% of the county's population was black folks. Let me show that to you. You want to pass a few of those out to those folks behind you. And you've already got one, I think. Take a couple of these. Pass those out behind you too, okay? Oh, sorry. And you can see that those, it's right there in the corner. Those counties all across the South are now starting an entirely new empire of cotton. Not in Virginia, only in the southern states, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, and areas of Georgia. Naturally, these new economic necessities meant that the slaves in Virginia became even more valuable. The slaves are more valuable than the land. If you've got 80 slaves, you're rich. Not because of the work they do, but because of the fact that you can sell them down the river. The ads, like I say, in our newspapers here are kind of chilling when you see groups of slaves that are being brought over the mountains and sold downriver. In our own Charleston newspapers, I have often seen this. The western counties were not conducive to large plantation-style agriculture, but there did arise one industry that utilized slaves extensively, the salt industry, which began along the Canal River in the early 1800s and had grown to a very large empire by the middle 1820s, and had been produced even the first American trust. Have y'all ever read about the first trust that developed in the salt industry here? Was copied many times over by the capitalist empire as it spread, but that trust got all of the salt producers to only produce a certain amount to control the price of salt. I'm going to pass out the famous, or just show y'all, the famous antebellum Kanawha County salt business. This is a real good book by Professor Staley. He's been here to speak before, but if you ever get a chance to hear him do so, this book is available here and at the Charleston Public Libraries. It talks about using slaves to make salt. They had to work 4 hours on and 4 hours off. Who were the first miners? The first miners are slaves in what they call dog mines that are all up and down the river valley here, because after they chopped all the trees down, what are they going to burn in the salt pans? They're going to burn coal. They start figuring out that they can burn coal in those salt pans. Many black people die in those mines because there hardly even have any roofs in the little dog mines. And many black folks are killed in those mines. The slaves were essential to dig this coal and to burn the salt brine off. This was very hard work, and I would think that many of these slaves that were brought over here were not owned by the people in the Kanawha Valley. They were rented from old Virginia, brought over for a season, and then sent back. There are even lawsuits filed against some of our leading families here because the original owners of those slaves said, "Oh, you didn't treat my slave well enough. He came back sick." There are lawsuits that you can see right here describing that kind of conflict. When it finally reaches the 1850s, there were, and it's marked down in the population stats, 2,000 slaves in the Kanawha Valley working in the salt industry or as servants in the fine homes built by the owners of these salt works. That's who the streets of our city are named for. These fine folks made their money off slaves. Folks, you got to, get over it and admit it, With the passage of the restrictive black laws, many free people of color began to filter west from the eastern counties and cross the mountains. Here, they hoped to reestablish themselves in areas like Wheeling, Parkersburg, Morgantown, even Charleston. There was also the possibility for mulatto people to change their social status by passing for white in communities that did not know their family backgrounds. In our Western Virginia census records from 1850 to 1920, and it's right over there, you can look them up, one can see a variety of racial designations listed for people in the same family, often moving from black to mulatto to white over time. There is also an important history of Underground Railroad work done here in our counties. Escaped slave families moved across Western Virginia, going mainly up the river valleys like the Kanawha, the Monongahela, and made their way to Ohio and Pennsylvania. Often Quakers gave helping hands to these escapees. But one should realize that the passage of the black laws, all free people of color and all slaves that had been emancipated by their masters were not supposed to remain in the state of Virginia. And interestingly enough, right here in the archives, I have found lists both for Monroe County, Monongalia County. There are several others, but I'm going to show you these lists. One is 1822. I'm going to give you some. And one is an 1850. I have both. I think you might have gotten those. Take one of those and pass it around. This is the 1850 list, so pass those out. I wanted to show you both because from the 1822 list to the 1850 list, they get even more detailed. Born of free parents, 5'9" high, a light mulatto. Those are the kind of descriptions the 1850 census finally has. And these lists are a register. If you are a free person of color, you have to register with the sheriff in that county, or you might get arrested. These harsh laws are, a variety of different laws are passed in different counties. But in some, the sheriff was real nice. In some, the sheriff could be brutal. So you can see how arbitrary these laws are for different counties. It became increasingly difficult for these people to stay or hide in the eastern plantation counties after the Nat Turner Rebellion. Free people of color were constantly moving further west to the area on the other side of the mountains or to different states that may have had more relaxed laws. As we can see by these listings, this is Monroe County we're looking at. I'm hoping there are other listings because I've seen them, I just didn't copy them all, but that's another area of research. Unfortunately, about the Underground Railroad, we can all understand that little information exists on the Underground Railroad because of its secret nature, which seems to have been maintained long after the Civil War for fear of possible reprisals in the era of Jim Crow. Why would you admit that you had hidden slaves when your neighbors were voting Jim Crow laws into your county right there in the 1890s? You're not going to talk about helping black slaves escape. That history is a very difficult thing to dig up. There has been some work. In fact, there was a speaker here 6 months ago, I think, when she came to talk about the Underground Railroad. It's a very interesting story. Though the western counties that became the new state in 1863 were Union in sentiment, Lincoln and the U.S. Congress still did not demand that the new state free its slaves after the war. Some of us were raised on the fiction that West Virginia was a free state. That is not true. West Virginia is accepted into the United States as a slave state. Only after the Civil War did they finally pass laws of emancipation. Most people don't even realize that. This dichotomy is made even more pertinent when the men who created the new state were voted out of office as soon as the ex-Confederate soldiers were allowed to vote. After the war, African-American population of West Virginia drops as the open borders drew this population further north: Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio. The next large influx of African Americans comes in the coal boom days of 1900 to 1920, which I hope we can discuss at a later date. Would be an interesting thing to discuss. I'm sorry that we don't have more time on this subject to talk about it completely. I'm of the opinion that Virginia's embrace with the slave system was a terrible economic mistake, which led to a tragic human disaster, the consequences of which are still being felt today. Look at our racial situation in the United States today. People still refuse to face the facts. I do not believe that there would have been a state of West Virginia if the support of slavery had not driven the state of Virginia out of the Union. Would have never been a state of West Virginia. There's so much more research to do on this, but it's interesting that as you look at these various, incredibly intractable situations where black folks are creating a culture that they know to be wrong, and their white masters know it also. It continues because it's based on the deep and unabiding reality of racism. And that racism is still with us today after you watch the campaign we've just seen here in West Virginia. That's my opinion, of course. But there is so much more research to be done. I hope young scholars will go into this and take a look at all these facts and figures. I also think that the history of black folks right here in Charleston is not written down yet. And that means from 1950 to 2000. I want to see more of those facts brought out. I hope people will be doing that research. I'm also of the opinion that the Civil War did not need to happen, especially with Virginia joining the South. If the people in Virginia had decided, which they were forced to decide by 1920, if they had decided that they were going to stay with the United States, the collapse of the states of the lower South would have happened within, I would say, 6 months. Just imagine a Union Army led by Robert E. Lee forcing states like South Carolina to get their act together and to follow the Constitution. That's another lost opportunity. I'm just putting that out as a sad lost opportunity. I could talk about this for hours. As you can see, I'm a very verbose soul. I have some more things up here you might want to grab, and I'd be glad to pass those out. But I'm eager to take any questions. So thanks a lot, and let me have some questions. Yes, sir.
Yes. Thank you for your passion and your research.
Yes, I'm afraid I am passionate.
This is great stuff. I think you've really hit on it when you talk about that the Civil War didn't have to happen. And if it didn't, it would have been that quiet little war that everybody expected in Manassas, the first battle.
Exactly.
But really, the great research topic would be what happened in the Shenandoah Valley, because that's really where the change was. When Henry Ruffner wrote his pamphlet in the late 1840s, the Shenandoah Valley was not a heavy slave area. In fact, there were real questions about whether slavery was appropriate. And when he addresses the pamphlet, he addresses it to the citizens of West Virginia, and he did not mean what we think of today. He meant everything from the top of the Shenandoah on the east side west to the Ohio River. And he proposed abolishing slavery in that area. And then just as you said, and I really enjoy hearing you say it, just as you said, you know, it would have clearly taken out Thomas Stonewall Jackson as a leader in the South. It would have taken out the only economic base that could support the Confederacy. But it also, as you say, would have taken out Robert E. Lee. I mean, truly, had abolitionists said, well, that's wrong to say, they wouldn't tolerate abolitionism, that's where the morality issue arose. But had slavery been seen as an economic defeating system, as Henry Ruffner said, and if people accepted that, the whole history of America would be very different. I think where it's lost is in the Shenandoah Valley, that slavery, because they became absolutely solid for slavery and Virginia in the 1850s, and the shift is in that time period. And if you take that away, it's a different world.
Lots of German Quakers over there.
Well, and that's the other thing is so many German and other people who come down and then come into West Virginia really are very uncomfortable with slavery. And there's a lot of people who left. Abraham Lincoln's folks left Virginia because they couldn't live in a slave state. Yeah. And it was quite an out-migration for them.
Larry's come and spoken here before, and he'll do so again. We'll get him back to speak again. Yes, ma'am.
When these Negroes came over as indentured servants, what if they got married and had children before their indebtedness was done?
It's a good question. I'm sure that it would depend on the master, you know. And you have to realize that as they brought black folks from Africa over, those black folks were, in quotes, first established into an indentured system. That indentured system may have easily said 80 years instead of 7, or 25 years instead of 2 or 3. In other words, it varied on the master. It also might have varied on the amount of money that the plantation had at that time. I can afford to buy these slaves, and I can afford to indenture 5 or 6 of them. That also made a difference on the slave's training. If you had a very valuable blacksmith, you would be more kind to his children. You see what I'm saying? In other words, it varies. It's a very ambiguous time period, and there's not a lot of facts. So I can't answer that question. But you can see she's asking what happens to slave children before an indenture is over, you know. And I can only say that by the 1680s, all these questions are becoming very important because they have to answer them. That's what these black laws are trying to answer. Any person born of a black woman slave was a slave. So right off the bat, that is made official by the 1690s. So I can tell you that there's very ambiguous laws, though, in different counties and in different, say a sheriff was a nice guy and he liked this black family, well, he might let them live there. But if he didn't, he might drive them over the mountains. So there's a whole series of ambiguous answers to that. I'm sorry I can't be more exact. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You know, you're talking about children, and it was fairly well established that a very fertile female slave was valuable. What's the flip side of that? What about a female slave who had fertility problems? I've not read a whole lot about the fate they had.
Yeah. I think it's interesting to think, and I think we can all identify with this immediately because it's so important to realize the difference between Africans off the boat, as they still brought African slaves in, and a young person that's born on American soil and becomes a Creole, in quotes, meaning a person of black race born in the United States, in the colonies. Their interesting facts are that the young women who were free people of color and who were slaves born in the United States, they have an average of 6 children, whereas the slave woman brought over from Africa, say Angola, Guinea, she only has 3. And it's interesting that one of the answers is she's breastfeeding longer. The Africans had a tradition of breastfeeding for 2 or 3 years, but the slaves that were born in the United States, in the colonies and the United States later, they had the English tradition of only breastfeeding for a year and a half, meaning that they became pregnant quicker. The breastfeeding helping to prevent, conception. So you can see that's an interesting cultural point, because slowly the number of African folks goes down and the number of African American folks goes up. In 1808, we all know they passed a law that is supposed to have stopped the African slave trade. That was passed in the United States Congress. And that is followed, sometimes it's broken, sometimes it's followed. But that shows that there is a different cultural norm for Africans that are brought in and for African American folks that are raised in the slave system itself. So I can only say that there are a variety of answers to that question too, because in different states there are different black populations. When you look at the situation along the southern coast of South Carolina, totally different than in the Chesapeake area. In South Carolina, those white owners, they left. They went to the city to avoid the malaria. They left black folks as, in quotes, overseers to control their populations, their slave people, and their plantations. So suddenly there's a totally different black population and African culture there. It's maintained much longer. You even have studies of African names that stick. They still use African names along this South Carolina coast when they have gone completely over to white names and Christian names in Virginia to name slaves. So I'm just throwing those facts out. Anybody else, please? Sir.
On March 3rd, Chris Saunders will be talking here at a lecture on the Underground Railroad.
Oh, good.
Chris Saunders was the gentleman that helped on the Wayne County, the Pauley family that William Ratliff, he was the one that helped with some of the court cases they had over in Wayne County.
Good.
Back a couple of years ago, but he will be lecturing on the Underground Railroad.
And that's March 3rd.
March 3rd.
Underground Railroad lecture sounds good. And you'll probably have that announced on the website, and you probably even have a leaflet.
Yeah, and also when that case came about, we did some research that the West Virginia Archives actually had a little pamphlet that they gave out during that case there. But it's interesting to note that part of that, a quarter of the slaves in Wayne County and Lawrence County, Kentucky, Pike County, Kentucky, Logan County, a quarter of those slaves were classed as mulattoes. And it's interesting how that came about, which of course we know that the white masters was having relations with the slaves. But it is interesting to note that was happening over in here, just as it was happening.
Exactly. I also want to point out that that's where we now have a new racial designation of Melungeon, and y'all have heard that term possibly. It's a mixed race term, and it's a very interesting and complex subject because many of the Melungeon people were passing for white. Many of the Melungeon people, in quotes, mixed race people, did not want to be associated with the slaves. They desperately held on to a whole series of what I can only refer to as fantasies. When they did, this is 10 years ago, the DNA studies, almost all of those Melungeon people are connected to Virginia slaves. That's just the way it is. They've had to change their tune in the various Melungeon organizations, which I have spoken at. And it's a very interesting area because we have a Melungeon population up in, right up in the area of Taylor County and that area. That is called the Guineas, and if y'all have ever studied that, there are many interesting stories about the Guineas right here. They were part escaped slaves, part white, and part Delaware Indian, which makes for a very interesting racial mix. Because as racism and the Jim Crow laws made it very bad to be black and okay to be Indian, the state of West Virginia, 1922 or some, I've forgotten the exact date, they went up there, right up there up on the ridge and built those Guineas, a nice, real nice elementary school. We're trying to help you folks out, you know. But of course, you have to let the black folks go there too. What the Guineas do, they burned down that school. Even to their own detriment, because they were then forced to send their little blonde-headed children to the Clarksburg High School that was for blacks. And it was a 2-hour drive and a bus both ways over those mountains. So you can see how racism reared its ugly head almost all over the place here in West Virginia. Please, any other?
There about a few free blacks who owned slaves. Do you know of a book that might have treat that a little bit?
Interestingly enough, we have Woodson's Free Negro Owners of Slaves right here, which is not a new book, but it's to free people of color so they can more easily buy slaves out of slavery. Quickly, of course, the Virginians passed black laws against that. But I want to point out up here a few books, and please come look at them as you leave, but they're all right here in your archives to look at. And we have an interesting collection of Virginia slave births, and this is an index that might help black genealogical research. So please take a look. There are very interesting books on African and Native American lives that are intertwined. Because like I told you, there are many, many people that escaped to the tribes and were taken in. But remember, there are also Cherokees who want to look as white as they can look. What do? Well, they build Christian churches, they get plantations. The next thing they do is start buying slaves. Many of the Cherokee plantations in northern Georgia are full of slaves. So you need to remember that that is a part of the quotient here too. Those slaves are even forced to go west with their Native American owners. And they end up in Oklahoma. And the controversy and the conflict is still going on there in Oklahoma. I have so many great books. I've taken a lot of my work out of the Peter Colchin book, American Slavery, 1619 through 1877. An excellent book, easy to get hold of. It's right down in your library, downtown library. I also want to point out the famous books by Professor Freeling, The Road to Disunion. I advise reading these books, even though they're not an easy read, because he is so detailed. But this talks about the political situation all across the South as Southerners further and further stumbled down the wrong path in supporting slavery and secession. So I advise both these volumes. They're very good. And please take one of these things up here that has all the material that the State Archives has that you can look up and do some research on slavery. It's right here. I know we're 7:15, but we got plenty of time for more questions. Yes, ma'am.
I'm from Eastern Carroll County and taught at West Virginia State, where I heard about a certain Mr. Carroll. Do you know anything about Mr. Carroll?
I only know that I think you're referring to the famous owner of slaves who married his slave. And I just know the facts. I wish there was better information on Mr. Cabell. The stories I have may be apocryphal. They may be quite right on. I only know that he owned the very valuable land right down the valley, and that he fell in love with his slave. That woman was the mother of 5 children, I believe, of his. And he even went to the trouble to literally have an ironclad lawyer's written down words on his will that left all his land to that black family of his. So what did he get for it? They came to his gate, called him out of his house, and shot him down right there in front of his family. Killed him in front of his house. Is that an apocryphal story?
That is correct. One of the gentlemen that used to work for the Charleston newspaper wrote it in a book, and that book was published right before he retired from the newspaper, and they had this book club down at the Charleston City Center one year.
Wasn't James Dent, was it, or somebody like that?
Yeah.
Jim Paul.
That is
Yeah.
correct.
And so his book should be right here available.
Yes.
And if anybody knows more about that story, they should tell me. Yes, ma'am.
I think when my son Robert Martin was at the Daily Mail, he did a story about a granddaughter when they moved, he had a name from the Mercy Snow West Elementary.
Oh, right. Yes.
And that was about 3 years ago.
And, you know, later on, we all know what happened to the property. That black family gave that land to the first black college in our area, and was a very good school and produced a large number of black scholars and teachers. So, any other questions? We're wearing ourselves out here. Yes, ma'am.
You indicated when you talked about the salt mines, the 2,000 slaves that were working in the salt mines. About what years or years were that?
That was an 1850 to 1860 time period. In other words, the number of slaves may have gone up and down, but I do want to remind you that some of those slaves could have been rented, not owned, but rented from their Virginia owners, because that's how they figured out how to make money off their slaves, to rent them out.
And would you say that most of the slaves that came to live in this area were from original Virginia?
I would say Virginia is the place that they came early on. You do realize that the huge influx in the coal mining era of 1910, 1900 through 1910 through 1920, brought in large numbers of southern slaves, Alabama, Mississippi. When they heard there were mining jobs out of the Deep South, they got out of there. They also knew that the UMWA did not support the Ku Klux Klan. So that was another reason to come join the Union and work in the coal mines. And so there's a large black population infusion in that period of time. Folks, it's been nice. I'm glad we got to come here and talk. And I've worn myself out.